Okay. We're starting. Okay. All right. Yep, you're good. All right. Okay. So, hi. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Bennett, your outreach coordinator. It's my pleasure to host our Lunch and Learn speaker series. A couple housekeeping announcements before I introduce our speaker. There is a restroom located just out that back door if you need it at any point. There's also some refreshments. I think we have cookies today, some coffee, whatnot. Help yourself as you need it. We're informal enough here that everybody will respect your need for your caffeine fix in the middle. It's fine. We do Lunch and Learns every second and fourth Tuesday. So our next one, so that you can mark your calendars, is October 22nd. And we have Ken Whooper and Tom Trombley, and they're going to talk about the first congregational church restoration after the fire of 1973. So that's the church just down Jefferson here. And then there will be an optional tour of the church afterwards if you want. So we will meet here and they'll do a regular presentation talk. And if you have some extra time that day and you want to go and then look in person at the church, they will take you down there to do that. So kind of a 2-for, a little bit of a special thing. And then just a reminder as well for all of our members, we have our member appreciation event this Thursday from 5 to 7. We'll have some nice treats and music and just a nice time to gather, see the museum, hang out with the staff, because we're real cool. You want to be with us, right? Right, Catherine? Right, Christy? Today we have Scott Furtaw with us. He is a controls engineer at NextYear for his day job, but he also does a lot around the community, including serving on the board of the Michigan Heroes Museum. Has a lot of his own knowledge and connections with the space program, and since we have our Spies in Space exhibit going on now till the end of the year, I thought it would be perfect to bring Scott here to talk about the space race, right?
Yes.
Right. Like it was a good idea, right? Okay. Awesome. I was also confirming that we were on the same page, that he didn't change anything. I guess I could turn around and look. Yeah. Anyway, so without further ado, thank you, Scott, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And so I grew up wanting to become an astronaut. Obviously, I'm not. I'm okay with that. It takes a lot smarter people than me to do those kinds of things. But I've loved the space program for a very long time. Just ask my wife, the education coordinator, Christy. She'll vouch for my passion. And when Jen called to tie this into the Spies in Space exhibit and asked if I could do a presentation on the space program in the Cold War, she asked if I'd be interested. I'm like, are you kidding? That's my favorite chunk of dozen years right there. There's a lot of exciting things that happen in a very short period of time. So the Cold War, a shot was never fired, as you probably know, but one place that the battle was fought, if you want to use the word fought, was in the space program. And it was a battle on showing the world who had a better form of government, the freedom and democracy that we enjoy here, and the communist government in the Soviet Union. And it was a pretty serious competition that started in the late 1950s and lasted through the 1980s. So the first thing we need to do, get a satellite into space. The Soviet Union accomplished that on October 4th, 1957 with Sputnik. And it was just a ball that orbited the Earth and it beeped, but that was a big deal. And we were trying, but we were not as successful as the Soviets were. It was our attempt to launch Vanguard a couple of months after Sputnik was launched. So they beat us putting a satellite into space. But about 4 months later, we finally got it figured out, and we launched Explorer 1 on top of a Jupiter rocket. And this guy right here, you may have heard of him before. This is Dr. Wernher von Braun. He was one of the German rocket scientists that came over here after the war, because this was one of his rockets. He designed the V2. Everyone remembers the V2 in the World War II, and he designed many of the rockets that we used in the 1950s and 1960s. So we each got a satellite up into space. The next thing, put something living into space. And the Soviet Union beat us there too. This was Sputnik 2 in November 1957. The leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Khrushchev, requested to have a significant space flight somewhere near November 4th, the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So that kind of led to, well, let's put an animal in space as close as we can to that date. So that's the dog that they sent, Laika. Not a very lucky dog. The spacecraft that she was launched in was never intended to be recovered, did not have a heat shield. So they sent one meal with her and it was poisoned. So she was on a one-way trip. But they beat us in putting an animal into space. And it took us about another year and a half before we accomplished it. And it's very tough to find. There were two monkeys that we launched, and we recovered them. They launched in the same ship, and we planned from the beginning to bring them back. Very tough to find a picture of Abel, but this is a picture of Miss Baker. She was a squirrel monkey, and she actually moved, after her mission, she moved to the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and that's where Space Camp is located. They had a nice cage for her with activities, and people could come up to the glass, and a normal life expectancy of a squirrel monkey is about 12 years, and they don't know exactly when she was born, but they're guessing she was about 27 when she passed away in 1984. She was a very popular exhibit at the Space and Rocket Center. Okay, so each country put an animal into space. I like to think we did it a little better because we recovered our animals. Next is to get a person into space. So NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, that's our government agency that runs the space program. They selected 7 astronauts. These 7, called the Mercury astronauts, back in 1959, with the goal of sending them up into space one at a time. And this is the Mercury Redstone rocket, and we were pretty successful with the Redstone, but the upper management at NASA wanted one more test flight, and we're going to put a monkey on it this time just to make sure everything's working really good before we put a person on it. So this is a chimpanzee named Ham, and they put him inside this container and put him inside the Mercury spacecraft at the top of the Redstone and launched on a suborbital flight, so went up a little over 100 miles up and splashed down the Atlantic Ocean. And everybody celebrated. Ham had some levers and some buttons to push, and he was less than thrilled when they got him out of the ocean and brought him onto the ship. He was a little agitated, but happy to be back. And that was on January 31st, 1961. So we got that done. The next mission, we're going to put a person on it. But before we did, the Soviet Union did. April 12th, 1961, they launched Vostok 1. If you translate Vostok into English, it means east. And they launched Yuri Gagarin into space. And a little fun fact, this launch pad is still used today. It's located in what is now Kazakhstan. And they still use this to launch people into space on the Russian Soyuz rocket. So there's actually been some Americans that have launched from that very pad going up to the International Space Station. So they beat us. That was April 12th. On May 5th, we launched Alan Shepard. Unlike Yuri Gagarin, Yuri actually orbited the Earth once, a full circle. The Redstone, I've got a tiny model of it here. The Redstone could not put anything into orbit. It wasn't big enough, it wasn't powerful enough. So he went on a flight that went about 125 miles up and then splashed down the Atlantic Ocean. It lasted about 15 minutes. So where are we at? For those keeping score at home, Soviets put the first satellite into space, the first animal into space, the first person into space, and here's our list of firsts. We weren't doing too well. So President Kennedy's getting a little concerned. So he brings a bunch of smart people to the White House and says, all right, what can we do? We need something big. We need something significant that we can do, that we can beat the Soviets. What can we do? And somebody said, well, we could go to the moon. The president said, you really think we can do that? Oh, yeah. Okay. So he set the goal. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving a goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. So in order to get to the moon, we need to be able to orbit the Earth. We haven't done that yet. We need to travel almost 250,000 miles away. That's where the moon's at. Hadn't done that. We need to survive in space for over a week. It takes about 3 days to get there, about 3 days to get back. We need to be able to rendezvous and dock with another spaceship in space. And we need to learn to get outside of our spaceship and do useful work. And the only thing we had accomplished at that moment was Alan Shepard's little 15-minute, 125-mile trip. So there were a lot of people at NASA that were in a little bit of a freak-out mode, thinking, here we are in 1961, and this guy just set the bar up here. In the next 8.5 years, we got to land on the moon. First, we got to get into orbit. There's John Glenn, first American to go into orbit. You can see his rocket, the Atlas, is a little bit bigger than the Redstone. There's a picture of the Atlas launch there. You can see John getting into the Friendship 7, and I have a cookie jar version of it right here. You can thank Christy for that. She found it at a garage sale for me one day. And you see, the size of the Mercury spacecraft and the size of John Glenn getting in. The Mercury astronauts would joke, you don't get inside a Mercury spacecraft, you put it on. Because it is very, very tight. And one trip went to Florida to the Kennedy Space Center, and they had a model of a Mercury spacecraft sitting there that you could get inside. I'm like, oh, this will be neat. And so I climb in, and wow, this is what John Glenn felt like. And I get inside, and I realize that my feet are touching one wall over here, and my head is touching this wall over here. And I thought, you put a suit on me, I don't fit. And I'm only 6 feet tall. So Mercury astronauts were shorter because they needed shorter test pilots to fit inside something that small. And here he is. There's his Friendship 7 spaceship, showing it off to President Kennedy.
Why didn't they make those vehicles bigger, knowing what they were dealing with?
It was the limitation of the rocket, the launch vehicle. Okay. It was only capable of carrying so much into space, so they had to make everything really small. So now we're moving into Project Gemini. And this one is big enough to carry 2 people. See, we're getting bigger rockets. This is the Titan II rocket. It was a modified ballistic missile, just like the Atlas and the Redstone were. I'm not sure how excited astronauts were to ride on top of a missile, but that's all we had at the time. In Gemini, I love the Gemini program. That's where we learned to do all those things we needed to learn to go to the moon, that we can live in space, we can eat in space, we can put a suit on and go outside our spaceship and do a spacewalk, we can rendezvous with another spaceship, learn to dock with another spaceship. It's a very exciting program. So we're getting ready to launch Gemini. And one thing with another difference between our space program and their space program is we did ours out in full view of the public. It's on national television, it's live broadcasts, it's everywhere. Everybody knows about it. All the schedules are out there for everybody to see. Soviet Union, they were not so open about their space program, but they kept an eye on ours, and they knew we were getting ready to launch a spaceship with 2 people. So they launched one with 3, just to beat us. This is the Voskhod spacecraft, which translates into Sunrise. And it's really not that much bigger than the Vostok, which carried 1 person. And the only way they could fit 3 people in was to not allow them to wear spacesuits. So they were put inside, the hatch was closed, and hope everything is sealed and works properly, because that hatch isn't opening up until they get back to Earth. That's only 7.5 feet in diameter. So pretty small area to cram 3 people in, but it was important to them to beat us, so they did. And then they beat us walking in space. So in March of 1965, Voskhod 2, and this time to allow people to wear spacesuits, they can only put 2 people inside. And this was one of them, Alexei Leonov. So he opened up his hatch, went outside for about 12 minutes, proved that you could do it, and made them first to do it. Did not anticipate how much his suit was going to inflate when he got outside, and had very, very serious difficulties getting back in. Had to keep letting air out to try to make the suit a little smaller to get him back in. So it was a little risky. So about a week later, we launched our first Gemini mission. This is a trainer of the Gemini, so it's barely big enough to fit 2 people in. The astronauts would say it was about the size of the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle, to give you an idea of how tight it was. So imagine spending up to 2 weeks crammed inside a Volkswagen Beetle with 1 other person. This was the first crew of Gemini. There's Gus Grissom. He was one of the Mercury astronauts. And John Young, this was his first flight. He had an amazing astronaut career, flew 5 more times, including walking the moon and flying the space shuttle twice. So they made 3 orbits and came home. The next mission was Gemini 4. And this was the first time an American opened up the hatch and floated outside. This is Ed White. He was outside for about 23 minutes. And I brought a couple of flight suits from the Michigan Heroes Museum, and I'll mention this one now. This is Jim McDivitt. He's from Jackson, and he was the commander of Gemini 4. So he didn't actually go outside, but he got to take that picture, so it was still pretty cool. So Ed was out for about 23 minutes, and it was starting to get dark, because they get a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes. And they were nearing sunset, and Mission Control wanted him back inside before it got dark. So they were getting pretty stern with him to get back in while he just wanted to enjoy the view. So he described being ordered back in was the saddest moment of his life. So in 1967, we had both done a lot of accomplishments. We both started new programs. We started the Apollo program, and that's what was going to get us to the moon. And the Soviet Union had 2 different but similar programs, Zond and Soyuz. So the Soyuz, this is the Soyuz rocket, and ironically they call the ship on top that carries the people Soyuz. And they could also put the Soyuz on top of their N-1 rocket, which you see is pretty close in size to the Saturn V that we needed to go to the moon. They still use this rocket today. I mean, they've made some improvements, but they still launch people on the Soyuz today as they did in 1967 from that same pad we were looking at earlier. Both countries also learned that spaceflight is very difficult, and when you make mistakes, the price is very high. In 1967. January 27th, we lost Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Gus is one of the Mercury astronauts, and he commanded the first Gemini mission. Ed White was the first American to go into space. Roger would have been making his first mission. He's from Grand Rapids, Michigan. You may have heard his name before. There's a planetarium named after him in Grand Rapids, and streets and statue and a lot of other things in town. They would have been launching about 3 weeks later. They were at the Cape doing a full dress rehearsal. So they're out at the launch pad, the hatch is closed when a fire started. And 18 seconds later, all 3 astronauts were dead. And they learned a lot about having flammable materials inside and 100% oxygen atmosphere, and had some electrical issues. So they and a hatch that took a minute and a half to open. You know, they had 18 seconds. The hatch, there was no way they were going to get that hatch open. About 3 months later, the Soviets were launching their first Soyuz spaceship, and there were some cosmonauts that were not exactly thrilled with the Soyuz spacecraft. They thought there were some problems, and they thought that it was being rushed a little bit, including Yuri Gagarin, the first person into space. He was definitely less than thrilled with the Soyuz design. But they went ahead and launched anyway, and there were some issues, and everything looked like it was going to be all right. And during re-entry, actually he survived re-entry just fine, but when the parachutes opened up, the parachute lines got tangled. And it probably wouldn't have mattered anyway, but what they do different in the Soviet Union, and still with Russia today, is where we land our capsules in the water, the Soviets land them on land. There's actually a little engine, or a little rocket engine in the bottom to help slow it down a little bit before it smacks into the ground. So he hit the ground at quite a high speed. So fast forward to summer of 1968, and our intelligence is saying that we see a giant rocket on a launch pad in the Soviet Union, and we're convinced that they're going to try to go to the moon before us, and we're pretty sure they can't land yet. They don't have that capability. But what our intelligence is saying is that they were going to try to circumnavigate the moon first, which means to send somebody around the moon and come back. So we had already launched Apollo 7 and the Saturn 1B rocket, and Apollo 8 was next on the Saturn V. You can see it's quite a bit bigger than the little Mercury Redstone from just 7 years prior. So the next time that we're going to fly, we're going to use the Saturn V, the first time carrying people and only the 3rd launch ever. And the original plan was to take Apollo 8, go into Earth orbit, and take up the lunar module and try that out and make sure that that works as planned. But the lunar module was delayed. It wasn't ready yet. So we don't have a lunar module ready for a flight yet. We got a giant rocket ready. The Soviets have a rocket on the launch pad, and we're nervous about them trying to beat us. So just about 3 or 4 months before the launch of Apollo 8, they completely changed the mission from an Earth orbit mission to we're going to send it to the moon. They're going to orbit the moon, and they're going to come back. And even Neil Armstrong would say that was gutsy. You know, he thinks Apollo 8 was a bolder, more daring mission than Apollo 11 was. So we launched Apollo 8, went around the moon, and you've probably heard about the Christmas Eve broadcast. It was very emotional. They read out of the book of Genesis. Mission controllers had no idea. All they knew was they were going to have an opportunity to be on TV. And the mission controller said there was not a dry eye in the control room. And Bill Anders, who was in the news recently because he was killed in a plane crash, took that photo. And it was something they never planned, they never thought about. You know, they're going to the moon, they weren't thinking about Earth. But all of a sudden, as they're orbiting the moon and coming around the other side, and look out the window, and they saw that. And Bill Anders got the camera, took that photo, and he famously said, "We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is we discovered the Earth." But we weren't content to just go around the moon first, because the goal was to land on the moon. So July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, planted American flags so the whole world knows that we were the ones to get there first. One thing that, so this is a still image from a video camera. There are no still images from a camera of Neil Armstrong on the moon because Neil's suit had the camera mounted to it. Nobody put any thought into, maybe we should give Buzz a camera and get a picture of the first guy to walk on the moon. They didn't think about that. So this is from a video camera. And one thing they learned was you can't tell who's who. So every mission after that, and to this day, two people go outside. One of them has red stripes on the legs, red stripes on the arms, and a red stripe on the backpack. So people on the ground can tell who was who. And Mike Collins, who sometimes gets forgotten because he was in the command module orbiting the moon at that time. So before I get to that mission, 4 missions later, Apollo 15 was launched. And Al Worden was on that one. He was also from Jackson. He did not get to walk on the moon. He was a command module pilot, so his crewmates went down for 3 days while he spent 3 days up in the command module. And met him a few years ago when he came up to the museum and said, did you feel bad about, not getting to, you go all that way and not get to walk on the moon? And he said, are you kidding? All the attention was on them. People left me alone. It was great. I had 3 days all to myself. He had things to do, experiments to do, and photos to take, but he loved being left alone. One other interesting thing about Al Worden that I was fascinated with, so somebody in our group asked him how nervous he was being on the top of this rocket launching to the moon. Now, Al was an Air Force pilot, and you got to think this was 1971, so keep that in perspective. And he says, nervous? Are you kidding? My buddies were getting shot at over Vietnam. I got to go to the moon. I was one of the lucky ones. He was absolutely serious when he said that. So Soviet Union didn't really admit to trying to beat us to the moon. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed that we learned all the, that our intelligence was correct, that they were trying to beat us. So once we beat them, the space race was kind of over. So we thought, maybe we could work with them. And so some people from Washington got together, some people from Moscow, and they planned the Apollo-Soyuz mission. So here's the American Apollo, the Soviet Soyuz, and a docking adapter between the two, and they launched from their 2 countries, and they docked in space. And it was a pretty significant moment to see these 2 countries working together, so many years of not working together. Then we developed the space shuttle. And again, everything's out in the open. Everybody knows we're building a space shuttle, and we're going to be flying it. And even though we said, we're going to be launching satellites and laboratories and telescopes and servicing telescopes, and we'll probably have a few military missions, classified missions, the Soviet Union could not accept that that was not a military vehicle. They didn't understand what we might be doing with it, but it must be a military vehicle, and therefore they needed one too. So the perspective of these photos, this one was taken from a lower perspective, and this one's up above a little bit, but the orbiters look exactly the same. So it's pretty close to a copy. And so we launched our space shuttle for the first time in 1981. It took them a while to figure things out and to build one just like it, and they launched theirs in 1989. And by then, we've been flying that for 8 years, and they realized, they really don't use this for military purposes. So now they got the space shuttle that they don't even know what to do with anymore. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and they were also learning that flying a space shuttle is very expensive. They didn't have the money. It never flew again. So they had this one, and they had 4 others under construction at the time, and no Soviet space shuttle ever flew again. So you probably remember in the late 80s, Cold War really calmed down, Berlin Wall came down, and we started to develop a relationship with the Soviet Union, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia. And at the time, we were planning a space station, similar to what's up there right now. At the time, we called it Space Station Freedom, and it was a joint venture. The European Space Agency was helping us out, Japan, Canada, were all joining into the Space Station Freedom project. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia rose out of it, and Russia was hurting for some cash, and our government was a little nervous about people that worked in their space program possibly going to work for other countries like in Iran. Ooh, what if we can keep them busy with something else? So we invited them, and flying a space station isn't a cheap thing, so it was a money-saving thing too. Reached out and said, hey, how would you like to join with our space station? Because they were planning another space station also. So why don't we put ours together and we'll work on it together? And I said, all right. So it was a money savings thing, but it was also to keep them occupied and send some money their way so they weren't helping people we didn't want them helping. So the first phase of that program, at the time they had Space Station Mir up there, and Mir in English is peace. So we would send the space shuttle up, we would dock with their Mir space station, and I think there were 7 American astronauts that took turns. Space shuttle would go up, deliver an American, come home, 3 or 4 months later, launch another space shuttle, deliver another American, bring that one home that was up there. This was Jerry Lininger from East Point, Michigan. He was the 3rd American to spend time on the Russian space station Mir. And you see, it looks a little funny. If you may or may not recall, my thing, so of course I remember, in 1997, when Jerry was up there, there was a fire that started on the Mir space station. And the media reported, because our media sources was their media, which was still rather state-controlled at the time. And the Russian state media said, oh, small fire, easily extinguishable, crew never in any danger. It wasn't until Jerry came home that we learned it was a 15-minute ordeal. He, honest to goodness, thought he was going to die, but they managed to survive the fire and clean all the smoke out of the atmosphere and continue using that space station for a while. So this was after the fire, when he was still wearing a mask because they hadn't been cleared to take it off yet. So we did that for about 3 years. This is a photo of the International Space Station. The very first piece of it went up in 2000, and the final component was launched in 2011 by our space shuttle. It took, I think it was about 35 space shuttle missions, several launches from Russia, a couple from Europe, and we carried stuff up for the Japanese and for Canada. See, about from here to here is what they call the U.S. segment, and the Russian segment's in the back. This piece was built by Japan. This piece was built by Europe. You can see the robot arm here. That's built by our friends in Canada. Giant solar panels. This thing, if you were to bring this down to the ground, this would be about the size of a football field, to put it in perspective how large this laboratory is. And that just shows all the components that went into it. And these pink solar panels, we're actually still in the process of launching those. The original solar panels, they get old and degrade over time. They knew that was going to happen. They don't produce as much electricity. And these actually produce just as much electricity in a much smaller package. That's just how much technology has advanced since the original ones were launched. So I thought this was going to be an outdated photo by today, but a hurricane got in the way. So these people are up on the space station right now. You probably heard about Sonny and Butch They're in the news a lot for the Boeing Starliner. So there's Sonny and there's Butch. They're still up there. They're going to be there till February. Their 8-day mission turned into an 8-month mission. This was taken when these two guys had just arrived. So they launched in a SpaceX Dragon. That's an American, and that's a Russian. So we each launch missions and people up to the space station, but in an agreement that we made with Russia, in the event that there had to be an evacuation, maybe one ship has to leave, and there's only one left, we never want there to be a time where there's no Russian or no American in the space station. So every American mission carries a Russian, and every Russian mission carries an American. So they launched, normally they carry 4 people, they launched with 2, so Sonny and Butch could be happy and be able to come home in February. These 4 were supposed to be coming home this week, but the landing area for the SpaceX Dragon is in the Gulf of Mexico, just off the shore of Florida. Not a good place to land, so next week is when they're thinking of bringing them home now. And these 3 launched on a Russian Soyuz, that's American Don Pettit. And I don't think we have any other international people in this photo, but it is completely common to have someone from Europe, someone from Japan, someone from Canada. It truly is an international space station. And it just amazes me with, our governments aren't exactly getting along right now. The United States government and the Russian government. But they manage to, not just the people you see in the photo, but everybody on the ground. The flight controllers in Houston, the flight controllers in Moscow and Japan and Canada and everywhere else around the world, put all of that aside to make this work. And it really is an amazing accomplishment. So a quick blurb about the Michigan Heroes Museum. If you've never been there, we're located in Frankenmuth. And we tell the stories of the Michigan men and women who have served in our military or become astronauts. This is the display of Jim McDivitt, and there's his flight suit. And this is Roger Chaffee, the gentleman from Grand Rapids that died in the Apollo 1 fire, and Al Warden, and there is his flight suit. So that is about all that I have. Anybody have any questions? Why do we keep using them? Why don't we have our own? So they made the decision about 10 years ago that it would be cheaper to hire somebody to fly people into Earth orbit than it would be to build a government vehicle to do that. Because private industry has a habit of doing things cheaper without all the bureaucracy. So they awarded 2 contracts, one to Boeing and one to SpaceX to carry people into space. Because NASA is trying to get out of the business of launching people into Earth orbit. They want to pay somebody less to do that. NASA is focusing on those bigger missions like going to the moon, which hopefully end of next year will be the first flight to carry people around. It'll be like Apollo 8. They're going to go around the moon and come back, and Christina Cook from Grand Rapids will be on that flight. So SpaceX and Boeing both are American vehicles launched on American rockets from American soil, which is all good things. Until they started flying, after we retired the space shuttle, we were paying the Russians to launch people, and they realized what a good gig that was. And price tag went up pretty high, so we're saving a lot of money by not paying them and paying SpaceX, and hopefully Boeing gets their stuff together and can do the same thing too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right at the moment, I don't trust the guy who owns these.
I understand. Yeah, and I don't know how much he's really involved. I mean, I always wonder, how can this guy, Tesla and SpaceX and the Boring Company, and I mean, how involved can he possibly be in all those things? So, but I get it. So China became the third country to successfully send, well, I shouldn't say successfully because they're only the third to try, the third country to send people into space. And they have a space station up there, and I think there's 2 or 3 up there right now on their space station. They have not launched people to the moon, but they're working on it. And there's some people that think that might be the next space race. Are we going to let China get to the moon before we return to the moon? Don't know, but they're definitely working on it, and so are we. So we'll see how that plays out. Yeah.
NASA is, my turn, the big guys in space, okay?
Yep.
Now we're coming along with these local people with money sending stuff up. Is the regulations, that's the word I'm looking for. Are there regulations to be followed or have been developed or whatever for, like, everybody? You got the FAA for, is there any of that going on with all these other entities that are sending stuff up?
Yes, great question. So, yes, and I can answer that in 2 different ways.
And who's the governor if we get into other countries?
Well, in the example of SpaceX and Boeing, those are both, yeah, and Russia's still a government program, China's still a government program. We're the only ones that are commercializing access to space. So, for launching people, like in the SpaceX Dragon or the Boeing Starliner, before it's in the contract, and before NASA allows any of that to happen, they've got this, here's the list of requirements you guys got to meet before you put our astronauts on your spaceship. Boeing is struggling with that. SpaceX has done very well with that. So there's that. And on the FAA side, you may have heard about the Starship. That's the giant Starship and Super Heavy that SpaceX is flying out of Texas. It's going to make this rocket look small. It is so big. They're building it they're planning on rapid reusability to bring the cost down of getting into space. And they've launched one 4 times so far, and every time they need to get a launch license from the FAA. And because they do things differently at SpaceX, they're not afraid to, all right, let's go fly and see what happens. Versus, when you're a government program, you're like, well, we better get this right, or we're going to get canceled. So they take more risk, and they're okay with failing and learning from it. So they launch one, something goes bad, it explodes. The FAA says, oh, all right, you need to, fix these things before we give you another launch license, because the FAA is also concerned with the safety of people on the ground. So and I recently learned that's even true in Florida, that the FAA issues launch licenses to every vehicle that launches out of Florida. And I had no idea that they were involved in that. So when there's something doesn't work right, like the SpaceX flight that took the last 2 astronauts up to the space station, the second stage, the burn that it was supposed to do so it would burn up and whatever pieces are left of it land in a very specific area of the Pacific Ocean where they tell all ships and airplanes, stay away from this area because there's going to be stuff falling. That burn didn't work quite right. And it didn't land in that part of the ocean. There was still nobody hurt, but the FAA pulled their launch license. So they will not be launching anymore until they figure out what happened with that. So I'm impressed by that. I had no idea that went on. So yeah.
So how's the situation with space trash in our atmosphere?
So there's not really trash in the atmosphere. There is debris in space. It's a very real risk. When astronauts go outside and take a spacewalk, it's on their minds. that there's pieces out there that no one's ever been hit by one, but the vehicles have been hit. We've had a space shuttle come home with a chip in its windshield and things like that. Things are traveling very fast. So it's a very real problem. Not one that is so bad that we don't allow our astronauts to go outside. We design the spacesuits to be able to withstand certain things, and there's areas of the space station that are built stronger than other areas. So in the event that they see a piece flying in there, like I think it's within a mile, if it's going to come within, I think, 5 miles, they do a burn to move the station into a different orbit. And there's other times where they'll tell the crew to get to the safe area for a little bit. Nothing's ever happened yet, but it could, and it's something they're always thinking about. Yeah?
So that space station is, my word, powerable to move? They have power within to move themselves in that case?
A little bit, yeah. But when you see something coming from a long ways away, you don't have to move a lot to really get out of the way. So they can, yes, yeah. In fact, around 2030 right now is the plan of when they're probably going to bring the space home, meaning destructive entry. They're hiring SpaceX to design like a large Dragon to hook up to the station, get it pointed in the right way, fire its engine to steer it to this area of the Pacific Ocean. Because if you don't do that, it'll eventually come back on its own terms, like Skylab did in 1979 when pieces landed in Australia, because it had no means of control. But so they're mindful of that and planning. The original plan was we were going to have the Russians launch a cargo ship to do that, but the relationship is not such that we're willing to trust that to work out right. So we're coming up with our own means of properly disposing of the space station when we're done using it.
Any other questions?
Well, thanks for being easy on me.
Well, I
again,
was going to say, I knew who to ask about space stuff, so.
But make sure you see the Spies and Space stuff here. There's some neat things here.
Did you have a favorite space toy as a kid that was
I don't remember if there's one here. I think there is one here. The Star Wars Millennium Falcon.
Oh, I do think there is.
And it was about that big around. I mean, yeah. In fact, it's still at home in the attic. It'll be passed down to Nolan one day when he played with it when he was a kid, our son. So yeah, that was my favorite toy.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks for having me.